Just from a show of hands, how many people are working in Angular day to day right now? Okay, so a lot of experience in Angular. How many people are kicking the tires, not sure what you want to do with Angular? Okay, a few people there. And how many people know absolutely nothing about Angular? It just sounded like a cool title. Okay, great. Well, hopefully I have a little bit of something for everyone. In this case, as you can see, my name is Jeremy Likness, and this was taken a few weeks ago before I got the spectacles, which puts me at a little bit of a disadvantage. I didn't realize my site had gone that far where I could only see the front 2 rows. So I'm actually seeing through the whole room now. So as I adjust to my perspective, the company I'm with, iVision, is right across the street. I can walk across the 17th Street Bridge for here. We do a variety of technical services. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this slide. You can visit our website. Please feel free to stop me afterwards and talk about the different types of infrastructure data center. And of course, I've got the application development highlighted. That's my passion and my area. For the talk this evening, I wanted to do a few things. One of the trends that I see, besides Angular, right? Angular itself is a trend, is a lot of discussion that's very hypothetical about Angular. And as I go around and I talk to people about Angular and projects, I find that a lot of people benefit from seeing Angular in the real world. How is it used? What is a case study? So I wanted to approach it from 2 angles that are a little differently. I want to talk about why, based on an actual case study of using Angular. And then I want to talk about what, not based on a list of here's what the Angular API looks like. I want to go through the different areas that it addresses and then drill into that functionality. So we'll do the why, the what. If we have time, I'll touch on a little bit of the how. And that's sort of the optimization when you're getting into a bigger project, what are the things you do? And then Q&A and hopefully answers. I will answer any question. I can't guarantee it'll be the correct answer. So let's talk about why Angular. One of the reasons why we like Angular is because of this, right? I mean, anyone who's used it pretty much agrees it's the bomb. However, it also runs this risk of being a trend, and people say, well, you know, I hear these conversations in the hallway. Have you ever done that where you overhear a conversation and someone's talking about something you're familiar with, but you don't want to just break in and say, but wait. But I hear this all the time with Angular, so I am biased. But the reason I'm biased is not because Angular is a trend. I'm biased because of this. And if we just take a look at the project I was on, so this was a 3-year project. 25 developers we ended up with. This was a globally distributed team. Let's see if I can flicker that a little more. So it was a parallel team, and what I mean by that is we had people in all time zones working simultaneously in similar areas of the application. We had 80,000 lines. Does anyone know what the TS is? Lines of... Good one, Fred. TypeScript code. So lines of TypeScript code. Now, if you're familiar with TypeScript, it's a superset of JavaScript. It actually can generate a lot more TypeScript. So there's probably more than 80,000 lines of JavaScript code in the app. And I always share with people, though, once we minify it, it's really just 1 line of code. But it'd be a boring slide if I just put 1 there. So we had 200 plus components. And when I talk about components, I'm talking about directives, filters, modules, anything that you would pretty much register and reference within Angular. We spent 3 years on the application. Not all of that was Angular, and I'll talk about that in a second. We saw a 4 times improvement. We'll zoom in on that. 4 times improvement. So we actually began this effort with JavaScript and Knockout. Any Knockout developers? So Knockout's a great library. It's come a long ways. At the time that we were using it, however, it was missing a lot of the features that we needed. So we started with JavaScript Knockout 6 months into the project, and you know, this project was a little bit unique. I'm not sure if you've run into this before, but the customer actually wanted more done faster. So I mean, go figure. So being consultative, we got together as a team and we said, let's look at what we're doing as a team and how can we do things faster. And the 2 things we really identified were, 1, JavaScript was killing our developers. And that doesn't mean JavaScript's a bad language. It means not everyone took the time to learn JavaScript and understand how JavaScript works. And there were a lot of object-oriented developers trying to turn JavaScript into an object-oriented class-based language instead of a prototypal language, prototypical. I always get that wrong and people always correct me and then I second guess myself. But so we looked at that. We also saw a lot of ritual with Knockout.js. So if you've used that, a lot of the functionality you wrap in functions and you define, here's a computed method, here's this, that, and the other. And we said, we wrote the item over here, we put it in the database. Now we wrote this model over here on the server. Now we're having to define it again on the client. It takes too much time just to add a single field, right, and get something done. So how can we fix that? So we made 2 changes. And I know if you're doing a scientific experiment, you're supposed to only change 1 variable, and we did change 2. One of those was we switched to AngularJS based on a proof of concept, and the other was that we used TypeScript. Now what TypeScript did for us is it helped tame some of the Wild West of JavaScript. All of our existing JavaScript code works fine with TypeScript. It's just a superset. But it allowed us to create interfaces to describe APIs. It allowed us to use class inheritance, and without someone having to memorize all these revealing pattern, module, I'm going to show you some of these immediately invoked function expressions, right? Instead of having to learn that, TypeScript kind of handled that out of the box. And then Angular cut down on a lot of the ritual and ceremony. And I'm pretty sure if you ask anyone on the team what lent the most acceleration, they're going to agree that it was Angular. 4 times faster development, and that really means if you're delivering a chunk of code, and if you're familiar with Agile, if you're delivering 60 points, we're saying 240 after that acceleration. So not that I put a lot of weight in how many times someone searches on Angular, but there's a lot of weight on how many times someone searches on Angular on this slide. So the blue line is Angular searches over time. The other lines are Ember, Knockout, and some others. So people are interested, they're looking for help, and it's definitely trending. So let's talk about the what, and this is where I'd like to give it hopefully a different angle. So instead of going through the APIs that Angular has and telling you their services, factories, directives, controllers, scope, tools, etc., I'd like to just break it down into these 5 areas. So Angular has a concept of expressions, and I'll talk about what those are, has a concept of glue, has a concept of containers, templates, and tools. And on top of all that, I like that he asked the question earlier about testing. Indeed, Angular is very testable. In fact, it was written with the goal of testing out of the box. So I saw a lot of hands of people who are writing tests for JavaScript. Who sees value in writing tests for JavaScript? Okay, good. There's a solid amount of hands. This bubble here was our biggest impact on quality for the project. So we received acceleration through TypeScript and Angular, but our impact on quality was writing tests and using tests to validate. I mean, if you think about it, when you have 25 developers going gung-ho on a project, then you can have a lot of issues if you don't have a suite of tests to run to make sure that you haven't broken something when you're refactoring or changing things around. So let's dive in. Any questions before I dive in on some of those bubbles now?
Was the 25 developers, was it all front-end developers, or was it mixed?
No, so the way that our team was structured, we started with a core team of all full-stack developers, so people who could deal with the database side, the middle tier, and the front-end tier, which probably in retrospect was a mistake. We could have benefited from having some really strong front-end developers on the team. But it was that core 9, then we expanded it so the customer built out their own team, and so we had a remote team, a customer team, and then they offshored a component, so we had an offshore element. And that's important, and I like to share that, because the offshore team was junior to mid-level developers. However, we were able to successfully manage that by having a solid set of APIs and documentation and standards around our process so that they were able to plug in and make things work. It was rocky, it wasn't an instant transition, but it happened successfully eventually. Eventual success, right? It's like eventual consistency, but.
In Angular, did the framework make your developers, I guess, do things in a certain Angular way, and did that contribute to your speeding up of development?
Yes, absolutely. So 2 biggest impacts, I believe, on development. This is just me speaking from opinion. One is I believe Angular did force developers to think in a component perspective. So instead of writing this class that does everything on the page, thinking about, let me do this part and this part, which allowed us to break it up and do more in parallel and test. Second, with testing, it changed the way they thought about API. Suddenly that obscure API that you're not sure what goes into it doesn't make as much sense if you're writing a test, because when you write a test first, you think, okay, I'm going to need these three things. What's the easiest way to see what those three things are? Then let's build the actual API to satisfy that. Yes?
How did you measure the 4-time increase in productivity?
That was velocity. So it was an agile development. So we had points and a backlog in a team, and we could measure how many points of backlog we completed from sprint to sprint. So that velocity increased fourfold. Yes?
Yeah, you mentioned earlier that JavaScript developers should think in an object-oriented way. Now, what you just said about components, is Angular bringing it kind of back to the object?
Right. So it's less object-oriented because JavaScript is an object-based and object-oriented language. It's more the inheritance chain that you're used to with structured languages like Java versus the concept of prototypes in JavaScript. And the scoping is a lot different in JavaScript, so you have to just understand those differences. So thinking in objects and components is a good thing, but trying to force JavaScript to behave the way Java or C# behaves is not a good thing. Yes?
How many custom directives do you
Custom directives, I would say that we probably had around 50. So we use Kendo UI and we use D3 as well. And anytime we saw anything that we even somewhat repeated more than once, we wrapped it in a directive and packaged it for the developers. So with Kendo UI, this was before it had first-class Angular support, and we were able to create directives. So if I was dropping a grid, for example, I could drop a grid tag, define my grid columns, just point an attribute to a data source, and I was off to the races. So it's a very powerful piece of functionality that I'll talk about. Okay, so I'm going to dive in. All right, one more.
Sorry. What about mobile? Did you have a separate team working on mobile, or was this app?
So this app, the goal was to build it in a way that would make it mobile friendly, but it was not a mobile first app. However, we had people on the team that were very familiar with that, and I'll actually show you some of that a little bit later. Okay, let's talk about expressions. So Angular has this concept of expressions that parses right in the DOM. They look a lot like JavaScript. It is not pure JavaScript. You can't go off and just write random JavaScript code in Angular expressions, but you can set values and you can evaluate values using this expression engine. It also has conditional DOM compilation based on expressions. So what that basically means is I can have a piece of HTML and decide if it's going to participate in my page or not. And what's nice about compilation is I talked earlier when there's a question about the $compile service. Well, once Angular compiles code, it's constantly watching and looking for changes, and that creates overhead. So if you have some code that you don't need that overhead, you don't want that to participate in Angular's compilation of the DOM. It's easy to initialize and set properties on your model, and I'm going to step in and actually show you how we're going to do this. So I've got a JS fiddle up. I want to keep this as simple as possible. And the first thing I'm going to do, there's a number of ways that you can wire up Angular. One of the easy ways is to go out to the CDN, code.angularjs.org. And I'm going to touch the 1.29. They just dropped 1.3, and I'm sure it would break every single one of my demos. So we'll stick with the safe 1.2.9 and paste that in. And then I can basically put a div in place and use something called a directive, which is Angular's way of extending the DOM. And then I'm just going to put a little expression in here. And I'm going to run it. And you can see over here that it evaluated to 3. So that's it. I just wired up and ran a full Angular application. So this is where some of the sweet spot from Angular comes in. Now let's try something a little different. Let's add a div. And then I'm going to give it a condition. I'm going to say if pancakes equals 2. I like pancakes. And then I should use tacos or a more relative one. And let's do waffles. So if waffles equals 2, I like waffles. So what happened is if I run this, we're going to see I like pancakes, I like waffles, which is absolutely not what I expected. And does anyone know why? Because I'm outside my app. I closed my app right here, and we want to close it right here. Thanks, I wish I had something to give you for audience participation, but. So now we've got a 3, no waffles, no pancakes. So all we have to do is come back up here, and we can actually, what is the shortcut to hide this part on the left? I'll figure that out eventually. So I'm going to do an ng init. So that's just initializing an expression. And here I'm going to set, do we want to do waffles or pancakes, by the way? Waffles. Waffles, wow, okay, unanimous, waffles. So waffles equals 2, let's run it. I like waffles. All right, so that's just some very simple expressions in Angular. Any questions before we move on? Cool. So let's talk about glue. This is really what attracted our team to Angular. And I'll give you a little bit of background. I don't know how many people here have a Microsoft background or work with Microsoft technologies. My background with it was in XAML technology, so WPF and Silverlight. And then fortunately, HTML5 came, clobbered Silverlight, saved the day, and now we have that. But for all of its bad press, one of the nice things about WPF and Silverlight is it used a technology called XAML. And what XAML allowed us to do is separate the design workflow from the developer workflow. And I was literally on projects where the design team was still designing the project as the development team was developing the project. And it just worked because of that separation of concerns. So Angular enables data binding, which gives us that same ability to separate our UI declaration from our code implementation. And that's very powerful when it's used correctly. It provides declarative versus imperative, and I'll talk about what that means in a second. And there's no special ceremonies. This was the big problem with some of the other frameworks we looked at. We had to wrap them in special code just to make it work. And we wanted to just use first-class JavaScript objects. And then designers and developers work happy together as a result of that. If you can see the smiley face there. So this is imperative versus declarative. So the code at the top certainly works, right? I mean, it's cool. In fact, a lot of people like to show off the regular expression chops, right? I know some people can rattle them off on the fly. They're like, credit card number is exactly slash, I won't because I don't know it. But basically, I've got a numeric test that's looking for digits in a regular expression. I'm grabbing that document, I'm adding a listener. And granted, this would be a lot easier if I was using jQuery, so I'm exaggerating a little bit. But this is imperative code, so I'm using code to create this. Now, if you look down here, I've got an input field, and I've got data ensures numeric. Now, which do you think is more readable code? Right, if you're talking to your designer and you're telling your designer, hey, can you mock up some forms, and I need this input field to be a numeric field, which do you think is the easier one for your designer? I mean, you can find designers who know jQuery, or you can say, basically, if you tag it with ensures numeric, we're going to ensure it's numeric. And that's the magic that declarative provides. With no special ceremonies, now I'm picking on Ember, but I'll give a caveat. I know some people who are very successful building applications in Ember. It's not my specialty, so I can't compare the two. But I do know that Ember has a lot of ceremony and rituals. Some would argue that's a good thing because it imposes a standard, whereas Angular kind of allows you to define your best practice. But here in Angular, I can literally just create a JavaScript object, and that can participate in my Angular app. There's no special Angularified type object that I need to create. So let's take a look at what Glue is in the browser. And let me collapse. And are there no JFiddle wizards who know the keyboard shortcut to toggle Control-Shift-Up? All right. There we go. Now we got more real estate. All right, so what I'm going to do for glue is I'm going to collapse this down to an app. And almost every Angular example shows you this ng app, and boom, you're out and running. The reality is you're typically going to have a name for your application. So I'm going to go ahead and give this a name. And I'm going to put an expression in place here. And if I run it now, this is going to fail because I haven't defined that application. So what I'll come down here and do is create an ify, because I really like ifs, if for no other reason. Does anyone know why I do that out of habit? Yeah, self-contained compartmentalizes the code. Angular plays really well with this pattern. So then I'm just going to say Angular module, my app, and I don't have any dependencies. I'm not depending on any other application. I'm going to run it, and my application's wired up. So now let's look at how this glue works. So I'm going to initialize a value called name, and I'm just going to give it guest. And then I'm going to create an input field, and I'm going to pass an ng model. So ng model is how I do data binding. I'm telling it, look at the model, look at the name, and whatever we type in this input field, I want you to update to name. So we'll just put that right there. And then we'll do an h2, and we'll say if there is a name defined, say hi. And here we go, we had a question about templates. Here's double mustaches, so handlebars, right? Hi, name, welcome. Might be a little redundant, but that's okay. So let's run this and see what happens. So I've got hi guest welcome, and then if I type this, you can see the changes reflected immediately. I didn't have to do anything special. And if I take it completely out, my condition wipes out that tag. So a lot of power just in that little bit. But the other piece I was talking about was this concept of POJOs, plain old JavaScript objects. So I can create an object called Jeremy. And I can give, well actually, let's be a little more generic. Let's make it a person. And that person's name happens to be Jeremy. And that's how you spell my last name in case you're confused about it. And it's pronounced Likness. Everyone wants to say Likness, but I was stuck with the Norwegian name, so to call that out. And my age is 40. So I've got that, and that's just a plain JavaScript object, nothing Angular magic here. So then what we're going to do is come up here and get a reference to this app that we defined. And I'm going to say when that app runs, I would like to get something called the root scope. And think of the root scope as sort of a piece of corkboard where all my data binding happens. So if I stick things in that corkboard, then they participate in data binding, and I can do some neat things with it. So with that root scope, I'm just going to say root scope dude equals person. I'll just use a different variable so we can see the difference there. Let's run this and make sure it's still working. It is. Then let's come down here and say, hi, my name is dude name, and I am dude age, years young. We'll run that, and hi, my name is Jeremy Likness, I'm 40 years young. So that's where you get away from a lot of ceremony. You can see I just took the object, stuck it on my corkboard, and it's part of Angular. We're good to go. Any questions about glue? So I'll give you a little tip for those of you who are working on Angular. 1.3 just dropped, and one of the big overheads that we had in previous versions was the fact that everything is two-way data binding. With 1.3, you can specify one-way data binding. So that means you surface something, you show it in the UI, and then Angular forgets about it. No more overhead of watching what's going on there. Okay, let's talk about containers. Now this is the part I think that gets people tripped up, and a lot of people start with containers in Angular. I like to kind of lead into containers. So it just means that you're tagging items and retrieving it. I hate when I see overcomplicated looks at dependency injection and inversion of control, and It basically just says, let me make it really easy to find something. I want to give it a friendly name, and then I want to grab that. It's 100% for pure JavaScript. In other words, I can create all my components in plain Jane JavaScript and still have it participate in the system. It does not change them into some weird Angular Frankenstein version of your object. It literally takes your object as is. And if you happen to have something that depends on something else, hey, Angular will take care of that for you. It's pretty good like that. So let's see what containers look like. I'm going to keep nodding my head down and up and down and up. We can modulate some sound that way. All right, so we'll come into my app. And I'm going to actually start with the most complex container first, and I'll tell you why. So I'm going to just extend this a little bit, and I'm going to add my wife. Her name is Doreen, and she was kind enough to take my last name as well. Her age is not polite to ask. And then we can have some people, which will be the person who is me, and Doreen. Okay, so I'm just creating some plain Jane JavaScript objects. Now what I can do in Angular is when an Angular app spins up, there's two phases. There's a configuration phase and there's a run phase. Configuration phase happens exactly once and then it's done, and then as your single page application is running, it's running, it's running, it's running. Now if you refresh the page, then configuration starts again, but one Angular app, one configuration page, you're done. So what that allows you to do is it allows you to create tools that you can configure for your application. For example, if you're using the tool that does web access, you can configure that tool to do some things like intercepting requests and changing those. And you do that at startup, and then everywhere the app uses it, it's there. So what I'm going to do is create a constructor function called peopleProvider. And the people provider is just going to cheat, and it's going to grab the people that I just defined. That's all it's going to do. Now I'm going to use something that Angular provides called extend, and I don't need to use it here, but I'm going to so that those of you who are working with Angular can take advantage of it. Basically what Angular extend does is it takes whatever's on my right and extends what's on my left using that. So I'm going to extend it with a function called get that returns this.people. So what's nice about extend with Angular is Angular binds for you. So with JavaScript, if I just created this type of object and I return this people would be undefined because it'd be in a different scope, and we learned about that actually at the last meetup. It'd be a different scope from where this people provider was created. But by using Angular's extend, Angular looks at what I'm giving it, the people provider, and it binds the get function so that this within that function is the people provider instance. So it's a very handy tool, and we'll see how that can be extended later on. What's that?
Typescript, public.
Oh yeah. Okay, so did I mention I'm a C# developer by day? Did I talk about JavaScript developers trying to, yeah. I live in two worlds, but thank you for bringing me back to this one. All right, so we've extended it. We've got a good call out from the audience to fix that. This is the Angular provider model. Pretty much anything you grab in Angular is going to go to a provider. And it's going to, the very first time you reference that item, it's going to call $get on the provider and get something. That's it. That's, you understand the entire dependency injection system for Angular. So let's do something with that. So what I'm going to do is, remember I said there's a run phase and a config phase. So in the config phase, I'm going to ask for the people provider. And what I'll do is give it a function called add_person. 'Add_person. 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 ' that pushes the person to that array. So in the configuration, I'm going to say people, provider, add person, and this is where we have some audience participation. Yes, but when I register it, I'll show you how it's different in a second. So I like to do my constructor functions capital, so I know they're constructor functions, but when I register with Angular, I use camel case. So live studio audience and the age I'm going to assume is mixed. And then when I run this, here's what's interesting. Even though I named this function people provider, the way I add it as a provider is just by calling it people and passing it that constructor function. So now it knows that there's a people provider, but I'm just giving it the name people. A little confusing, but in config pass, that's when you call provider because you're going to configure something. And in the run pass, that's when you just call the function itself. So let's run this real quick, and I'm going to do my cheat here with my expression and just keep myself honest. And we've got a issue, so let's take a look at what that issue is. So has anyone heard, is Angular generally friendly with debug or unfriendly? So unexpected token var, so probably what I did was I forgot to close something up here.
Farther down.
Where you call add person is the method, you forgot to close it. Down farther.
Farther, farther, farther.
Yeah, we're actually called method.
Oh, yes. Okay, so we're going to call that, close that out, and we can actually just run our JS hint here, and this will give us any other issues that are outstanding. And it's probably telling me, what are you doing with this people, right?
Yeah.
We should probably do something like this people equals people. That might make more sense. Let's run that. It says I have beautiful code. Great. So we're still in the game. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to add people as a dependency. So remember I said Angular makes it really easy to give it something and then receive something. So now we're going to receive people, and I'm going to tell it root scope people equals people. So I'm just plugging it into that cork port. So now let's do this. I'm going to get ahead of myself and use a filter, but it makes it easier. So I'm going to do that, and I'm going to do that. So the filters actually format your data, and we'll take a look at those in a minute. So I'm going to run this. So what we've got here is the person passed through the JSON filter named Jeremy Likness, age 40, and then we've got this list with Doreen and the live studio audience. And actually my person didn't come through because I called it dude, so if we change this, you should see me twice. And there I am twice. So that is the most complicated part of using Angular, and I purposely did it first. Because what you might want to do is you might want to do something like this. Let's give my wife her own service. She'll think that's pretty cool. And then in that service, I'm just going to say this Doreen instance equals Doreen. So again, constructor function, I'm grabbing that definition of Doreen, setting it to the service. Well, Angular gives me some shortcuts. So if I want to use the shortcuts, instead of doing the whole provider and the $get, I'm not configuring Doreen at all. She's always going to be Doreen. So what I can do here is I can just say app service Doreen service. So when I'm passing something to service, I'm passing it a constructor function. Angular will automatically make a Doreen provider, and $get is just going to call new on my constructor function. That's all that means. And so then I can come here, and let's see what I call it, Doreen. I should have probably called it Doreen service, but that's okay. So we'll do Doreen, and we'll set Doreen to the root scope. And then up here, We'll do Doreen, pass that to JSON, and run that. And now you see Doreen's appeared on the end of the list. So that's one shortcut. It's probably a little goofy to notice that this has this Doreen instance, right? So if I really wanted to get just down to the data element, I'd access it with a dot like this, Doreen.Doreen instance, and now it's just her name. But it's probably a little goofy to wrap it in a constructor function when I already have the value. So that's where a factory comes in. With a factory, and let's call this the Jeremy factory, or how about just the Jeremy factor? That'll work. So there's two parts to a factory. The first part is a function that takes in any dependencies that I need. So this function is for dependencies. Do I need the Doreen? Do I need the people? Do I need any of these other Angular things? In this case, I don't need it, so it's an empty function. The next thing I do is I return whatever I want to provide. So in this case, I'm just going to return, I think I called myself person, so let's do return person. Let me double check that. Yeah, so I'm up here as person, so I'm just going to return person. So this is what gets a little bit confusing with Angular, right? Because a factory is not creating something so that every time you call it, it creates a new thing. It's just a different way of registering your component with Angular. Service is a constructor new function, a constructor function. Factory, you're just going to return whatever that instance is. So now we have a Jeremy factor, so we can come down here, grab the Jeremy factor. Yes, that's right. I keep wanting to be a factory, but it's just not happening. And then this time I'm going to give myself a name. And Jeremy factor. Okay, and then we'll come down here. And now I'm going to be 3 times. It's kind of like I keep trying to one-up Doreen here. All right, let's say. It's not fair because she's not here. And there I am at the end. So now you've learned about a provider, a service, and a factory. But it turns out you can also just very easily store values as well. So I can do app.value persons and give it people. It's not a constructor function. It's not a function that returns anything. It's just an object that already exists. And then if I come down here and I grab persons, root scope persons equals persons. Persons JSON. Run that.
Persons.
Okay, all right. Gotcha. No, thank you. And there we go. We have the list on the end. So those are the various ways. Now, is anyone familiar with constant versus value? Has anyone heard of that? Does anyone understand the difference between the two?
Constants never change, right?
Constants can change. Yes.
Constants are available at your config time.
Right.
Constants can't be augmented by decorators. Well,
Correct. So constants are things you make available in the configuration pass. Values you make available throughout. So typically you'd probably use value unless you specifically know you need that item in the config pass, and then you use constant. It really doesn't matter. I can come in here, and because I'm not doing anything with configuration, I can change this to constant, and I can run that, and it's going to be the exact same. And you notice, so just a quick side note, so what we like about Angular is it makes it really easy to resolve dependencies. Here I'm just adding the dependencies to the list. In my constructor, if I add the dependency to the constructor, it grabs it. Now there's a problem when you minify code in that gets clobbered, but you have 2 options to satisfy that. One is you can create a static array that has the list of dependency names on the object, and 2 is when you configure it, you can do something like this. I'm just going to make a little change here, and I'm going to throw this inside of an array. And then I'm going to list out root scope, people, Doreen, I should have probably cut and paste, but I know you're enjoying seeing my typing skills on the type cover for Surface. Paid endorsement. And then function, root scope, whatever. I think I got it. There's 5. Again. Okay. We'll run that. Looks the same. But what's nice about this is, let's say we minify, and now we turn this to RS, which is what the minifier will do. And this time I will cut and paste. So we'll go like that. Yeah, let's get some mouse in this. Do that. I think it's actually faster if I type it, huh? So we'll do that. So even though I changed the name, because I've given it the list of items, it should come out the same. And those are containers. Any questions? Yes?
It's not specific to containers, but there's kind of two Angular styles. Now there's the using the variable, which you're using, or there's using the getter method where you can change. Is there a reason you choose one or the other?
When you say using the variable, what do you mean?
Like you set up var app, everything's got app.config.
Right, so if you want to see, I can show you this really quick. The way I prefer to do it is if we go here, and there's an Angular, I'm appearing all over the place, I know. We'll go into app, controllers, measure controller. So this is the way I prefer to do it. Let me zoom in for you. Actually, it's for me, but we'll pretend like it's for you. Okay, so that's it. So I prefer to, since there's a well-known name in my immediately invoked function expression, go ahead and resolve the app, pass it in as that, and just reference it that way throughout. And then I don't normally just create a JavaScript function and register with Angular. I'll usually do that in line. I just like to illustrate that so people understand that JavaScript is a first-class citizen with Angular. Does that make sense? Okay, so templates. You've already seen a few of these. It's pretty much anything that determines or serves as a pattern or a model. Now, there's terminology in Angular of what templates are, which are these reusable pieces of HTML. And then there's a terminology I'm using more generically, which is any place I repeat myself, right? So I have this idea of a template, and if I'm repeating myself, I want to have some way so that I don't have to go through all the code and all the ceremony like that. So don't repeat yourself is a good maxim to follow. Usually, instead of trying to guess at like how I'm going to build this awesome directive, I will literally do it the manual way first. And then if I have a second thing, I'll do it the manual way second. And then I'll look and say, okay, 80% of this is the same, let's refactor it. I find that's much easier to do than to try to guess up front everything you're going to need. We have UI templates with Blue, so data binding participates in those. We have reusable, what I call text templates, which are filters. And filters are just reusable things that transform data for display. And then we have reusable components, which are called directives. And I like to call these components, and really anything in the ecosystem is that, but because web components and directives have a similar parallel, but this is where you're actually creating new DOM elements. So for the templates, we're a little more involved, so I'm going to save you some of the exhaustive typing. And I'm going to show you this example. Anyone use WebStorm? Like WebStorm as a, yeah, it's a popular IDE. What I like is Alt-P, right there, zoom in, it's great. So we'll take a look at the code in a second. Let me show you what's going on here. So we'll come over here, you have a trial, I gotcha. We'll open this up. So what we've done is I have a people list. I've been on the planet this many months, and I've got a little slider. It's not polite to ask my wife's age, so it doesn't show up. And then I also just called myself out again a second time so I can demonstrate a concept. So in that concept, let's take a look at first the HTML. So what I've got here is my app. And then I've got an inline template. Now here's what I love about Angular. Angular treats all templates the same way. So it's basically a key that it uses to go to a cache and retrieve some HTML. So a lot of times when I'm mocking up a page, I'll create a inline template like this where I'm using the text-ng template type and it's inline. However, if that starts to get large, then I can pull it out to a file, and the way I reference it is exactly the same. Because I gave it an ID of person.html, I can do an ng include of person.html, and either it's already in the template cache because I put it in a script, or it goes out and retrieves that file from disk. Either way works, and you can swap those out. So that's one template, and you can see it's expecting a person with a name. Then this is our pipe that we pass to a filter. So I'm filtering the age. And then I've got this age widget. So you can see I'm not actually putting a progress bar here. I'm just putting an age widget, and I'm telling it how to evaluate to person. Down here is my age widget. And this is a template for a directive. I'll show you what that means in a second. But it's a progress bar. I'm assuming people still aren't living too far past 120. I'm personally a vegan, and I'm pretty sure I'm not going to make it either. It's got a value, and then if we actually have an age, it's going to show individual age.years. So let's see what that looks like. So this is how we repeat through a list. So people is on that corkboard. I'm saying every item in that people list I'm going to call person. And then I'm just going to include this template. And this template already expects person, so it renders person.name, person.age months. It's as simple as that. That's just reusing a template. Now there's a little bit more going on here. I've got a singular person, and I'm initializing the person to a value within the array. So you can do funky things like this with the expressions. Pretty much anything that references an item or compares an item is fair game within Angular expressions. So now let's look at code. You've seen all this before. Here's something new. We could spend the next 2 hours talking about directives. Directives are a pretty powerful tool. If you go to the Angular webpage, I think it still says it teaches HTML new tricks. And this is the way we add that declarative piece of functionality. So what I'm saying is I have something called an age widget. It really only makes sense as an element. So it's not going to make sense as an attribute on another HTML element. So you'll have ones that make sense as both. Some might be an element because it's a widget you're rendering. Sometimes it might just be an attribute that changes behavior, and I'll talk about that in a second. So this is just saying, keep it to an element. With scope, scope is that corkboard, again, that you use for data binding. And what's neat about directives is they have what's called isolated scope. All that means is that you probably are going to reuse directives throughout your page. You might have 15 of them. So it doesn't make sense for them to have a global corkboard, because every time you have different data, you want that directive to behave differently. You don't want it to share that same scope, right? So if I'm binding it with me versus binding it with my wife, I want it to see two separate scopes, otherwise they're going to collide. But I can pass through to parent scopes. So what this is saying is whatever I have as individual on the parent scope, I'll reference as individual on the child scope. So the way that worked out in this example is here, where did that work out in this example, by the way? No, here I've got an age widget, and the individual is the person. So person is what's passed into the template. I'm telling the widget that I want individual to reference person. So you can see how I could change this to point to Jeremy or point to Doreen or point to whatever. So that's dynamic. And then within the template itself, it just worries about individual. So that's how you map the inside to the outside world. And then we've got a template URL. So you can have an inline template, you can reference it. Sometimes scopes are just behavior, directives are just behavior, and they don't even have a template. And you can say, toss it. So that's a very simple directive. I purposely kept it simple so we could get to the other parts of the talk, but that is where you see a lot of the power of reuse in Angular. So now I've got a function, and again, the reason I'm doing it this way is just to show you you can have regular JavaScript functions and then they can participate in Angular. So here's a function that takes a string h to months, and then it's saying if it is defined, if it's truthy, I should say, and when I cast it to a number, it's the same thing. I'm kind of cheating here. Return this times 12 plus months. If I actually have something, return as years, otherwise return not defined. So that's just a filter. It takes something in, spits something else out. For Angular, what I can now do is I can tell it that I have this thing called a filter. And filters are set up, again, there's a function that takes dependencies, kind of like a factory. So if I want to use them, I can. And then I return my actual filter. So in this case, I'm returning age to months. So when we come up here and we pipe in 2 months, it's basically knows to take whatever's on the left side of the expression, pass it through this function, and render it. And so again, you can imagine for things like currency, I'll show you that in a second, for things like numeric, for dates, etc. So in our application, for example, we created a date filter, and the date filter didn't just format the date, but it understood the locale because it was also a globalized application, so it was able to render the date in the correct format based on locale. And so that filter could take in a dependency on our service that managed locale and format it that way. And then as we go down, you can see it's pretty straightforward. Define the filter, define the age widget, then we run it and just bind things. So pretty simple example, packs a lot of power. Any questions about templates? Yes?
So the way that you access global scope in your filters is by having it as a separated function that lives in your controller. Because the example you were talking about was localizing your date via something in your service.
Right.
So how did you get the, did you pass that as a variable into the filter?
Right, so what I would have done is something like this. App filter, my date, function, date service. So there's my dependency.
Yeah.
And then here's my actual filter. Return function, string, arms, return, date, service, make it awesome, string with the parameters.
I didn't know you could pass in.
Yep, so you can do the same thing with factories, filters, and directives. Take that outer function, pass in your dependencies, reference it on the inner function.
Can you inject a different controller into an ng include?
You could, yeah.
You know how you-
So I'll give you an example. I'm working on a project right now that basically has 3 different variations of an item. And so I'll have a master controller like this. And I use controller as, and we can get into that discussion if we have time at the end. So I have a master controller, and then within it, I might have if control.type is 1, ng include template 1, ng controller equals foo controller as control. Okay, and then what I can do is have another line like this that goes here, and this time it's control type 2, template 2, and this is bar controller. So what I'm basically doing is the master controller is now conditioning which sub template and sub controller is being spun up to handle that request. Does that make sense? Who asked? You asked. Answer your question?
Yep, perfect.
So you can also embed that controller in the snippet that you're bringing in, because Angular compiles it. So if this was not here, but it was at the parent tag of this, it would work the same way. Okay? So some flexibility there. All right, so tools. Tools is another major accelerator with Angular. Loaded with out-of-the-box tools. These are just a few of the tools. There's dozens, possibly hundreds of tools. There's a log tool. so that you can log errors and warnings and not worry about, does the browser have a console, does it not have a console, and do I have to change my code if I no longer want to log to the console because of performance. You use this service, it has a provider, and the provider, you turn it off, you're good to go. You turn it on to debug. HTTP and resource. HTTP wraps XML, XMR, HTTP requests, and all that funkiness in the browser. So wherever you live, you just deal with HTTP. Has overloaded methods for get, put, post, etc. It is fully asynchronous. It supports success and errors. It also supports a groovy concept called interceptors. Has anyone worked with an interceptor? All right, a few people have. So interceptors are global ways that you intercept the HTTP pipeline. I'll give you one example real quick, easy to understand. You're writing a service with authentication and you're using a token for authentication. So you create an interceptor that says every time Angular talks to the server, it adds an auth header with the token. Then you add an interceptor that takes the response back, and when it has a token, you store it. That's an example. No developer ever has to worry about whether there's an auth header because you're intercepting it in the pipeline. Very powerful. Another use that I've seen on projects is you have a REST service that throws an exception, and in the exception body, you have information about that exception. Your interceptor can take that, package it, send a message, and you have a nice alert appear, and then get dismissed and fade away. It's a very powerful functionality. We've got Ng Animate, which works with the animation library, and it just works. You include your animations, have some CSS. I'm very aesthetically challenged, and I can create animated displays with this Ng Animate. Very powerful tool. Ng Route is how you handle your routes in the browser and your paths. It's got a way that you can configure it so that you can map your parameters, you can map your controllers, you can handle asynchronous requests. So for example, let's say every time you load a new page, you want to make sure you have an updated user context so you understand security. You can have it wait to get that context, load the page, and then render it based on that. Am I starting to sound like an Angular salesperson? A little bit? So let's take a look at another example. We'll come back to this and come out of whoa mode and go into tools. So for my tools, yes, I know I don't have, okay, let's open this up. So this is it. This is what this app is doing. It's giving me punches, juices, sizes, costs, and ratings. So let's take a look at the code for that because I think you'll find it interesting. So the HTML for this is right here, that whole page you just saw. So I'm basically repeating for product and product, showing the name, the description. Here's a built-in filter for currency, so I can format that $, and here's a rating. That's it. Now let's take a look at this code. You will not see cranberry juice or what was that DVD player, it's a Blu-ray now, or key lime. You will not see that anywhere because this is going to a live service. So what I've done is I've set up my URL here. And that happens to be an OData endpoint. That's fun to test on. So I've got this log, this deferral. I make the request. I get it. If I'm successful, I resolve it. If there's an error, I reject it. So this is the promise pattern. Again, could be an entire talk, but asynchronous request. Good, bad. Down here, I've taken that service I just defined in the root scope. I initialize my products list, I get it, then set the products. So that is the code to fetch and render a list over REST API. Starting to see how powerful this can really be. Any questions about how this is set up? And of course it's testable. So it promotes testability from square one, including the fact that there's a mock library that comes out of the box with Angular. So I have unit tests that run probably 80 unit tests in maybe 100 milliseconds. And this includes service requests, but because Angular is testable out of the box, I can mock it and tell it, basically I'm expecting them to ask for this URL. Let's make sure that they actually ask for it. And then when they do, just return this value without actually making a service call, for example. Very easy to do. We can take a look at that. Provides its own set of mocks. Works well with QUnit, Jasmine, there's other frameworks as well. And it has its own Uber test framework that I'm the least knowledgeable of, which is Protractor. So I understand it's a pretty powerful framework. It gets into coded UI and actually manipulating the browser. We did mostly tests right beneath the UI layer and found that that worked really well. Testing, this is kind of my little plug, right, for test-driven development and testing, and promotes cleaner APIs, well-organized and quality code. I've seen it in action. It's not an opinion. Okay, Testable. Let's take a look at Testable. So I showed you earlier this GitHub repository with this Angular Health app. Let me just show you what it looks like. I've got another deck on building that. And if you're interested, this was made with a set of commits so that you can go step by step with the deck and see every step by which the application was built. Let's just go ahead and see it running. So it's a responsive app that basically computes based on metabolic rate, BMI, target heart rate. And I can basically become a short person and be obese, or a tall person and be underweight. And I can change this and that and the other. So straightforward, and we support metric. Pretty cool, right? So all we have to do with this wonderful app is just go to test.html in the end. And you can see that we ran 83 specifications for that. So I've got tests for basal metabolic rate, target heart rate. I've got tests for conversions, unit of measure, gender, filters, etc. Now, one of the unique things about this app is if you're not used to using controller as syntax, in other words, if you're passing scope all over the place and you have $watch throughout your code, you want to take a look at this because you just saw I could toggle and click and do all these things. Those are all separate controllers. They all update. There's not a single scope and there's not a single watch in the entire code base. And that's just using ECMAScript 5 properties. Basically, Angular will handle this for you if it's done the right way. So let's take a look at what some of these tests are real quick. So look at the page source. You can see, now what I like about Angular, so I do a lot of the backend on Microsoft with ASP.NET. Someone asked about ASP.NET MVC. MVC is very much valid. I have a model on the server. I have a controller that's surfacing information. And then my UI is now the single page app, which then is like Inception because it has its own MVC on the page. However, with all of these included types, people are scratching their heads. You can bundle those very easily. So either you're an MVC and you're using bundle config, or you're using Gulp, Grunt, one of those tools, and you're uglifying, which I always think is funny for minifying. But you can totally collapse these into single things. That was a lot of work just to tell you that, but trust me, we're going somewhere. All right, so here's an example test. So I've got a before each function. So what this says is Angular, give me a mock version of my application. And I called it help app. It gives me an injector. So give me your filter service, and I'm going to reference the gender filter. And then here's a great test. It should be defined. I always start all my new modules like that. Seriously, it sounds tongue-in-cheek, but I'm going to make a new controller. I go, I write the test, get the controller. It should be defined. It fails. I go, I build the controller. I include it. You'd be amazed at how many people might like check it in code and clobber it and not have the reference. Your test fails. It catches it. Everything's beautiful. So then we've got, what happens with null, with true, with false, etc. So these are pretty readable tests, right? And then we can just write these. And then there's more involved tests that mock the HTTP backend. And I wish I had a ready example here, but the code I was thinking about that I was working on is for a customer under NDA, so I can't show you that.
What framework is that?
This is Jasmine. So Jasmine's nice because Jasmine also has asynchronous support. So what I can do with Jasmine, let me see if I can, I can't do it here, but let's do it over, Do I still have the fiddle? I have the fiddle. All right, so one of the things that's nice about Jasmine is, let's say you have an asynchronous function. You can do something like this. You can say it, blah, blah, should do something, right? And then you take this done, and then you do something asynchronous. So let's say we call a promise. So service get, then function stuff. So this is an asynchronous call in my then. What I'm going to do is I'm going to say expect stuff to be cool, and then I'm done. And then that Jasmine will wait for that done call, and it can set timeout. So it handles asynchronous in a really elegant way. All right, we still have a little bit more, and I know it's getting close to beer o'clock in the evening. So this is my Angular from a different angle. See what I did there? Okay, so we talked about the containers. It's testable. It's good. You have a new approach to look at it. Well, let's talk about the how. So what did I learn in 2 years? Let me adjust this. Okay, great. What did I learn in 2 years of pounding this Angular app? And this is the money deck right here. So these are the things that we find powerful. I'll just walk through them really quickly. If you have a large team or a team that's not well experienced with JavaScript, I recommend Typescript. If you're knowledgeable about JavaScript, your team is, it seems to get in the way. That's my experience. But with a big team, highly recommend it. Have a convention, have a structure. Don't just drop all your files like this. You'll regret it as the application grows. Controller as. This is very important for organizing code and using some of the features of Angular like extend. There's no need to have scope or watches. And every time you make your own watch, you're basically adding to the digest loop. And when you actually go in and start performance tuning, and you see that a person hits a key and digest loop fires 672.5 times, then you realize something's up. And watches contribute to that. So controller as, using properties instead, make a big difference. And I can show you what that's like if we have time. JavaScript first. There's no need to do Angular special things. You can create a nice JavaScript object. When I did the health app, if you actually walk through the steps on that, and I'll have the link at the end of the deck, I created the functions for the BMR, the BMI, and everything standalone. Pure JavaScript. I can pick it up and take it to some other framework, some other app. It doesn't have to be in Angular, but I register it with Angular and take advantage of the containers and everything else. Properties instead of watches. Value. So if you have a common name, if you have a base URL that you're using in more than one service, register it as a value so you only change it one place, not a dozen places, because that URL will change, right? Use log. Don't use console log, use log. Then you can turn it on and off. Use the exception handler. Angular has a built-in exception handler. You can replace it. So if you want to log exceptions on your server, for example, you just replace the exception handler, take it, log it, you're done. Provide. Provide is how you configure and decorate certain things, and it's beyond the scope of what I want to get into on this talk. But if I have my own logging needs, I can still use $log, and I can use provide to intercept the definition and change it and put my code in the pipeline, so to speak. So you can decorate and modify existing objects without replacing them using provide. Angular extend is a great way to get the binding when you use reusable objects. Injector, if you have to lazy load or reference something on the fly, for example, if there's a component that out of 1,000 page refreshes you only use one time, bring the injector in and then just access it on the fly. The injector lets you say .git and have it wire up the instance for you on demand. It's like lazy loading for components. Resolve for your routes. That's the asynchronous resolution before it renders the page. Batarang. Who uses Batarang? Few people use Batarang. It's a Chrome extension that's Angular aware. So it lets you inspect your models. I can basically show you that one, not here, but over here maybe. And so what we'll do is if we pull up our Chrome tools, you see I have an AngularJS tab. I tap enable, and now suddenly I have these scopes that I can expand. I can look at performance as I'm loading, so it's going to tell me where my watches are taking place. So it gives me all my watch expressions, gives me a dependency tree, so on and so forth. So very powerful for debugging Angular apps. We've got bind once, that's new with 1.3. So there was a bind once library. In 1.3, if you prefix with 2 colons, it does a one-way binding. So if that value is not going to change, bind it once, forget about it, no more watches. Ngf. Can someone explain the difference between Ngf and Ng Show?
Ng Show doesn't even render the DOM element.
Right. So Ngf, there's a big difference. You can Ng show and Ng hide, and that basically means this condition is true, show it, otherwise hide it, so on and so forth. But all of that HTML gets compiled and watched by Angular. If you have, for example, my example, where there's 3 different ways to edit an item, and I'm using a master controller, I use Ngf because I don't want it to even think about those other 2 types. If it's type 1, who cares about 2 or 3? Don't even compile it. If I used Ng Show, it would compile the entire DOM and just hide those elements. If I use Ngf, it actually removes them from the DOM. So it's not even something that you deal with. So big difference. And then interceptors we talked about with HTTP. So I'm going to talk really quick about the stack. It doesn't matter if you're a Microsoft SQL developer, MongoDB, or any other backend service. You might have the driver, you might use an ORM like Entity Framework, you might have Node, you might have MVC. Angular plays well with all of those, and I've seen the app, all different ways. Doesn't matter what the backend is, you expose a REST compliant service, Angular can consume it. This is the reality of what we see from Angular. So this is an example from an app I'm working on where we have these autocomplete text boxes, right? So you start typing something, the list gets narrowed down, you pick it, and whatever, and there's probably like 10 different tables, right, that we've got to go to. So what I'm doing here is I'm just describing what's interesting to me from the table. I just want the item identifier, that's my option ID. I want the description, that's my item value. I've got a filter, and I'm going to call this foo. So that's step 1 that I do. Step 2 is I have a directive that basically knows to ask for foo and bind the picked one to foo selector, and I'm done. Anytime I have to add a new table, those are the 2 things I have to do. That's the power of using something like Angular directives. This directive actually has the service bundled in the directive, so it handles making the calls, rendering the text box, handling the dropdown, and updating the selected item. This is the URL, so github.com/Jeremy Likness. The other URL you'll want to remember is slideshare.net Jeremy Likness. That's where this deck will be posted. That's where all the other decks are. They all have embedded links that take you to source code and everything else that you might need. And as you can see, if you can just remember slideshare.net/Jeremy Likness, you can get to these links, which are all the steps as fiddles that I showed you this evening. It might not be line for line, but pretty darn close. And then this advanced link at the bottom is a course that I have that's video on demand. Just write this down, Likness, L-I-K-N-E-S-S. So you have to spell my last name right. But Likness-13. You use that code, you get like 2-3 weeks free access, no credit card required or anything. You just access it. It's about 12 hours of Angular courses on demand. That is my Twitter on the bottom. I'm with iVision, and I appreciate everyone coming out tonight. Thank you.